Funny hand, yeah. All right, all good?
Yeah, let's go. Hi, welcome to this episode of Help Me Understand with Dr. Thomas Jeffrey. Today my guest is Dr. Carey Ruiz. She is an assistant professor of sociology at Campbellsville University, where she teaches courses related to social and criminal justice. Dr. Ruiz specializes in social inequality and is particularly interested in how stereotypes are influenced by social structures that motivate people into action. She often collaborates with other researchers in the area of examining relationships between poverty and eugenics, and human trafficking as well. Dr. Ruiz is very involved in university student groups, discussions on race relations, and has led as panel discussions on race and poverty in her community. Dr. Ruiz also serves as the Director of Diversity and Community at Campbellsville University. That sounds like a lot. Sounds like you're really busy.
I stay pretty busy.
You're also involved in the women's studies. Can you tell us
Yes.
just a little bit about that?
Yes, actually, this is pretty exciting news. Campbellsville University has just launched a Women and Gender Studies minor, and it will be effective this fall. So students, actually, there were some courses offered in the area this semester, but next semester, students can begin to take the core courses that's required for the minor. And we're very excited about this because a lot of people don't understand women and gender studies. They think it's more of a fluff discipline. But what's interesting as we move into the 21st century, into a more global economy, the ability to engage with people from different backgrounds and understand different perspectives is becoming more and more crucial. So this minor is going to really give our students an advantage as they move either into graduate school or into the job market.
Okay, so it's an element of diversity. Would that, or is that a way to describe it?
Certainly.
As maybe a specialized from a women's perspective under a diversity umbrella. This is what I'm kind of hearing. I don't know if that's accurate or not.
I think that's a good way to describe it, actually. And if you think about it, and I have a background in women and gender studies myself. I took a graduate certificate when I was going through graduate school. And what's interesting is we have so many years, millennia of information and knowledge. But most of that has come from a male perspective. And so now there's this new body, not fairly new. Women and gender studies has been around for about 50 years in academia. But all of this body of knowledge that's not tapped, it's unexplored.
Right.
So it is an element of diversity, but it's also, its own academic program as well.
So almost like they created their own, I don't want to say content, or there's this literature out there, let's say, and research and whatnot, that really is just sort of sitting there and never made it into the mainstream of academia. Is that?
That's
and now
correct.
people are discovering it's like finding a treasure chest and like, oh my gosh, look at this.
Yes.
And, yeah.
Yes, I like to think of it as, what was it, the C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. When they go into the wardrobe and there's this whole other world.
Right.
It's almost, that's how I think about it. It's just that there's a whole other world of knowledge that we can get into.
Yeah.
And certainly to have that kind of emotional intelligence and, again, ability to understand diverse perspectives, I can't stress enough how critical that is in today's market.
Now, how far back does the study like that, would it begin? From the dawn of time and then just sort of work its way? Or is it more of starting, okay, here's where we're at, and maybe just curious in terms of how that works out as a program?
I think that's a really good question. It really is going to be specific to the discipline. So that is another critical aspect of this minor, is that it's interdisciplinary. So, for example, we're going to have a women's history course. Well, it'll be women's U.S. history. So it'll start with, relatively modern history of women's experience in the United States. There's women's literature courses.
I see.
Yeah, so the core course, the Women WGS 200, will be more of a survey course. There'll probably be some women's history. There might be some policy. There will be some
women
policy.
Women in business, women in politics.
Oh, goodness.
All
yes.
the things, huh? Okay, cool.
Yes.
Can
definitely.
you just audit? So if somebody just wanted and was interested?
Absolutely.
Okay, cool.
Yes.
Well, let me ask you about sociology and being a sociologist. What
Yes.
is sociology? Help me understand.
Of course, it's interesting because I went through coming from a small town, and I was a first-generation college student. So I would tell people, as an undergrad, and even when I was in grad school, that I was studying sociology, and the response would be almost immediately, "Oh, so you're going to help people, social work."
Yeah.
So, no, that's not it. That's not what it is. It's a behavioral science, so it is a science, and that's one thing that is important to be clear. It's not philosophy. It's not journalism. It is data driven. So what we talk about, even though a lot of times there are times when it sounds intuitive, and I think this is one thing that students get hooked on, is that we think, well, we're all humans. We all have the human experience. So my experience is probably like everybody else's, and that's not true. We all have these different human experiences and worldviews, but it's a social science. It focuses on human behavior, and perhaps the key difference from sociology than another discipline such as psychology, which they're very close, where psychology the starting point for psychology is to look at human behavior from the internal perspective. That's where they start. So how's the brain wired? How are you genetically set up to? Sociology looks at the external impacts on human behavior.
So the external into the internal, like
Yes.
explaining possible environmental factors like behavior or something like that.
Absolutely.
That may not be intrinsic.
Right.
Okay.
What did you learn what did your family of origin, what was that like? I told my students recently, we were talking about social class, and I said, I don't, somebody who's tries to be mindful and is cognizant of diversity, you don't want to get into stereotypes at all. But I did say, if you ever want to ask one question of someone and get a pretty good idea of who they are and where they come from, ask them about their social class of origin, and that will tell you a lot. Just something like, was your family rich? Were they poor? Were they middle class? Were your parents educated? Were you first gen?
Right.
That can tell you a lot about how someone has experienced the world and also how someone sees the world.
Well, what I know from being in a book club with you is that that can be
Yes.
deceiving to ourselves, really. That what we might have in the past said, yeah, we were part of that class, like the middle class. There's way more to it than that, and in fact, the way the middle classes change, or what we consider that to be middle class, it's not what we think it is, perhaps. So sometimes we can be a little bit self-deceptive in terms of
Yes.
That alone. So yeah, it made me realize there's a lot more to it than just putting yourself in a category. And it's like, okay, this defines,
Right.
economically.
Checking a box.
Anyway. Yeah, check that box. That's fun.
Yes. It can be, why do you like basketball games over the opera? Why do you prefer to eat sushi versus beans and cornbread? That kind of thing, right?
Yeah. So when did you get interested in being a sociologist?
Oh, that's a funny story. When I was in college, and it was probably my sophomore year, I had no idea what sociology was. None. I went through high school. I went through a year of college. I could not. I would have been like my family and friends back home. I would have said, "Oh yeah, social work." I had no idea. It's interesting. A friend of mine and I were driving. At that time I had lived in my hometown, which is near Owensboro, Kentucky.
Okay.
And so we were both at this community college, and she was taking a sociology course. And so, but we were going to go visit a friend in Eastern Kentucky. So being the 18, 19-year-olds that we were, she's like, hey, we're leaving Friday. I've got a test on Monday. Why don't you read to me from this book as I'm driving so I can study, right? That was her way of studying. So I'm reading this sociology text.
So y'all opted out of the radio, and here you are
right.
reading
I'm
her
reading
sociology
the
textbook.
Sociology text
Okay.
on the way to visit our friend. And I'm reading this, and I'm thinking, oh my goodness, this was so interesting. And I had never, some of the things, and ironically, it was about race, which is my area. I'd never really considered or thought about, and I declared a major before I even had my first sociology course. So at that point, I transferred to another school. I went to Eastern Kentucky University for a while, and 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 that's when I took my first social class, and it was confirmed. And it was a love story.
You've been in love ever since.
I'm still a total geek when it comes to sociology.
Are there, I guess, areas of sociology? I don't know much about it, but it seems like because you mentioned that race is an area.
Yes.
So, what sort of areas are there?
Well, criminal justice is one. Criminology. That's
Okay.
probably a big area. My area was inequality, so it was race, class, and gender. That's
Okay.
what I focused. So by the time I got into, especially a doctoral program, they want you to really hone in a particular area. So mine was inequality. There are environmental sociology, which we actually have an environmental sociologist in Louisville. Stephanie Holcomb-Kreiner is there.
An environmental sociologist.
Yes.
That's a mouthful, and trying to get your head
Yes.
around that.
Yes.
What would that entail?
Looking really at the physical environment. And so now a different offshoot of this would be epidemiology. In fact, I know someone, it was one of my former students who he got his sociology doctorate, specializing in environmental soc, and then he's now practicing epidemiology, which is how is it that we organize our societies that contribute to certain illnesses? For example, COVID. You know, what is it about the wet markets that one help promote some of these viruses or alter some of these viruses? And in addition to that, how is it these viruses spread? And then when you have communities in close proximity to one another who don't have access to health care, Right.
Well, I guess the one that came to mind was, I guess it was last year, and sort of around spring break, everything seemed like, okay, well, maybe. And then, students went off and interacted, and
Spring break.
and all of a sudden, it's back,
Yes.
sort of thing. When you were talking about it being a science, the idea of, subjectivity and objectivity come up. So there's, and because I think of quantitative, just some numbers, and so I could ask you on a scale from 1 to 5, but then there's a whole nother, the qualitative aspect of that. How do those come into play in terms of, as you're researching and as you're putting together sort of what's going on?
I think
Analysis.
Yeah, sure. And sometimes you'll have very diverse camps. So you have the people who are like, no, it's quantitative all the way, and it's the numbers crunching, right?
If you can't measure it with the number, then it doesn't.
Right.
Because it's all feelings and emotions.
Exactly. But if you, but then there's another camp that says, well, what does this really tell you? About, so for example, I did a study years ago, and I use this as an example in my classes, where I put a survey question up there. How do you, let me see what the wording of the question is. Do you believe that affirmative action disadvantages whites, right? And it's yes or no, okay? And so you would have it, and you could quantify that. You do quantify that, right? So many portion of people. But it tells you nothing about why someone would feel that way.
Right.
So there's another piece to that story that's just as important. And so from my perspective, it's really a both and. I think that they both have a solid place at the table in terms of explaining human behavior.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know one of the things I do is I always have a comment box, in the part of the instrument. So why did you choose that, or why do you believe that, et cetera, because
Explain.
sometimes it's, especially if you only have two choices, well, there's not a maybe in there, so I had to pick one, but I felt this way. So that it's that that subjective piece that's really important.
Yes, and sometimes people won't answer quite honestly certain questions on a survey because there's that social desirability.
Right.
Even if it's confidential or anonymous, there's this fear that I'll be judged.
So what did you answer for number 5?
Exactly, exactly. Or they just, there's that response set where they just go down and
Right.
and it's a little harder to do that when somebody's talking to you,
Yeah.
And you can pick up on things such as body language and voice inflection, which I think is all part of the
Well, I've
story.
never been ambitious enough to do the interview sort of qualitative. That's
Yeah.
That's a lot.
Requires lots of money and lots of time.
Right. So one of the things I was interested about was the idea of how stereotyping and social structures contribute to what you call action or moments of action, or
Right.
what exactly?
Or inaction. So one of the key aspects, and this was from a research that I did, where essentially I was looking at how people understood race and racial issues around them, right? And again, we would talk about social desirability. Most people know how to respond to this. That's the favorable response, right? But then I followed up with asking them, giving them vignettes. Well, what would you do in this situation?
Okay.
And what was interesting is that, and it did actually support some theory that if when people have close relationships, regardless of what they know about stereotypes or perceptions, when people have close relationships with members of a different group or a diverse group, they tend to be more inclined to action, to speak out. Because there's an awareness sometimes that when we speak out against something, that we will be called on the carpet about it, right? So if somebody tells an inappropriate joke at a dinner party and I don't know people very well, am I going to say something, or am I just going to let it slide because maybe it's my supervisor or my boss or somebody's supervisor or boss, and I just don't want to rock the boat, right? People are going to be more inclined to speak out and to compromise their status when they have a close relationship with someone.
Okay.
And where stereotypes come in too is that, and this is where a lot of the social science drives this, is we know stereotypes, right? We all can be aware. I mean, we could ask everybody in the room, and somebody knows a stereotype that they've heard. Now, whether or not you believe it personally is a personal thing, but the fact that they exist is structural.
Yeah.
And we want to think that bias is always about a personal defect or a personal issue that someone has, and that's not the case. Oftentimes, that there are these things that exist outside of us that are also operating in the background.
So while we're explaining that, and my question is, so we're born unbiased? Do you think there's a genetic thing, or maybe it is there, but it might be minimal, just because of tribalism and centuries of that sort of thing?
As a sociologist, I would say that there's no genetic propensity to bias. I'm not sure that would be inherent. I think maybe personality types that would lend itself to maybe more deference to authoritarian or to not questioning certain things, or personality types that might make somebody a little more rebellious or a little more curious. I think those can be biological. But I think the messaging in terms of our in-groups and out-groups really are learned. I do think that's a social learning
One of the
mechanism.
things that I've found, I teach advertising, an advertising class, as well as like in e-commerce, but not as much there. But stereotypes, they were really common. Really, I mean, now we've went to more animated characters, so a gecko, is that a stereotype? No, but previously there were quite a few, and so when we look back, and then one of my assignments is we look back at some of the stereotypes, and it's pretty scary what was going on even 40, 30 years ago.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that, in terms of race, in terms of gender, a lot. But, right, and I think...
And as an external expression, something we can see, that stereotype.
Well, and I think, so maybe in a little bit more response to your first question, because, stereotypes, and especially as it comes to marketing, and you said it's marketing, right? It's the message that's being presented in mainstream media. Do our brains love easy access to information? Yes. Yeah. I think we are wired to our brains use a lot of energy, so we like to have very quick, easy lines to understanding our world around us.
Yeah.
So I think prejudice in that regard, in that kind of prejudgment, because we're constantly trying to process information and make sense of what we're seeing, I think that can be more of a wiring in humanity, the way that we're organized biologically.
To take the easy route.
Exactly. But those stereotypes, when we talk about things like race prejudice or gender or ability, status, I think the stereotypes are informing those prejudices, right? I mean, if we never had racism, for example, maybe our prejudice would be along the lines of something else, right? But that's a whole other conversation. We brought this bias in towards certain groups over time, and that became part of our cultural tapestry. But if it had not, then perhaps we would have used something
We
else.
might still have bias that we create on our own from an experience. So getting back to the subjectivity of it all.
Yes.
Just interaction with someone else or something like dogs, like little dogs.
Oh, yes.
I have a bias against little dogs.
Did you have an experience?
I did, actually.
That's it.
So, but I was talking with someone recently, and I think I was saying bias and interchanging that with discrimination, and now you brought up prejudice. Can you help me understand, I don't think that I should be using them interchangeably now, like the internet and World Wide Web. Technically, they're different, right? But who wants to get into that level of detail? But I do want to be more accurate, especially since this is such a big part of the conversation today.
Yes.
In the world, not just here.
Certainly. And I think that is what's getting lost in the national conversation as well, is honestly, and this is a strong opinion, but I think a lot of people don't know what the heck they're talking about when they get on Twitter and they get on the news and they start talking. And it's so loaded. The subject matter, and I'm not saying that this, the subject matter is so loaded. And people say something and then somebody grabs onto it. And, these are super, super complex issues. Yeah. And maybe I'm biased toward my own discipline. But I think, from a sociological standpoint, inequality, these are not easy topics. Yeah. And we do want to use our personal experience a lot. When you're already at a disadvantage at that point because you're so limited in what you've experienced. We all are. On what we've experienced directly. So that to say, you're not alone, I think, and I think these terms do get muddy, and the way that I define them in my classes is prejudice is a belief, it's an attitude, it's a prejudgment. Okay. And I think we're all inclined to do this. Sure. When they get nasty, when we start to pull in the race and the gender and all the bad stuff when it comes to prejudice, that's what's coming from the outside. Those are the stereotypes that are informed. Discrimination is an action, Okay. That's when you are, and that's informed by your prejudice, certainly. Right. So they're not so far apart, but there is that nuanced difference.
So to have a prejudice or a bias, either learned or experienced, having that is maybe part of the human experience, but acting upon it. Yeah. I mean, you go from even, understanding that you might feel a certain way, acting on that belief in a negative, that's. Yeah,
then you're in problematic waters.
Gotcha. Okay. So dealing, and if we can deal with the thought part of it, preventing some of the action part of it, I guess. I mean, I don't. I guess one of the things that I am interested in is a discussion on diversity, and so and what that what is that, and what's the one of the questions I have about, so like when we say diversity, what are we really talking, just really basic, and I know you probably, this is like 101, but help me understand, because I wasn't able to take your class, so and when you get into the public discourse about it, all these terms get thrown around like
Yes.
crazy, and I kind of, honestly, it's like I have to step back and maybe even shut it out a little bit because I don't know what's going on. I feel, as you say, overwhelmed with all the information.
And it can be overwhelming. And I think so with diversity, it's difference, right? You're just talking about difference, and this can be difference of religion. It can be a different political point of view. It can be a different. Do you like UK or do you like U of L? Who do you cheer for?
Wait,
do you like sports
there's
at all?
a neither, right? There's not only two choices, right?
Yeah, and that's why we also like to compartmentalize it, right? You
Right.
have to pick a box. So yeah, it could be that, so when difference is difference is difference, and so this is what I tell my students all the time. The problem is the difference makes a difference. If the difference didn't make a difference, then okay, so what? We look different, we think different, we act different. But we've organized society in such a way. One, we started putting preference on certain differences, right, over time. And then we start to build those preferences into our policy and into our laws, right? And so, we think about Jim Crow. There are certain differences that we start to hierarchicalize in terms of race, and then now we create some laws around it. Now we create some policy around it, and now we're in a society. This is a social issue at this point. It's not just people, thinking, oh, I don't like the color of your hair, kind of thing. So that's where it gets complex and layered. Is that difference starts to mean something, and mean something impactful that's affecting people's lives.
So, with the Jim Crow preventing from voting, right?
Right.
Blacks from voting,
Right, and separate but equal spaces, and yeah.
And so that was pretty blatant, and overcoming that was a big deal, and maybe I should say is a big deal because Dr. Williams from the political science,
Yes.
I've asked him quite often, like this gerrymandering thing, and you see some of these maps and it's the same thing but different, or more
Yes.
more nuanced, or more. Is that maybe, I guess a question I have is going from some blatant stuff where, come on, you just, don't say that, don't do that.
Right.
You're free to think any way that you want to, but action becomes,
Yes.
as you were pointing out, that's when it crosses the line.
Yes.
But at some level, if it becomes really nuanced, we're not even sure what's going on, much less whether we're
Yes.
acting, helping it out. I don't know.
And then, but considering the precedent that it's you think it's not like it hasn't been done before, right? So now is this just a new way of telling an old story or singing an old song? And then you're right, it's the subtlety sometimes that gets people too, because it's not on the nose anymore, or at least in some cases. And so people say, there's the inclination, it's like, oh, you're just making too much of it, or oh, you're just stirring the pot, kind of thing, and that's unfortunate too.
Well, the gerrymandering is not preventing people from voting.
Right. It's just making it very, very difficult.
Or it's to what I can understand, it's minimizing the impact. So if
Yes.
you know a district is going to vote a certain way, so Democrats, let's say, if you structure it so that instead of them getting 2 out of 3 votes, they get 1 out of 3 because of the way you structure.
Yes.
Those sort of nuances, and again, I don't pretend to understand any of it other
Right.
than, well, okay, I do understand enough to know that
gonna say, that's a
something
pretty good
weird's going on, right?
But the literacy tests that they put in technically weren't preventing people from voting either. They just made it extremely difficult.
Yeah.
The Ku Klux Klan that were threatening people weren't stopping people from voting, but they were scaring them into not voting.
Yeah.
It's those kinds of nuances that sometimes you start to see the thread coming through. And that's one of the things too, as we're talking about diversity, that's important that you have to consider this. I tell my students that there's in sociology, we have this term empathetic understanding. And so empathy is essentially just trying to understand. It doesn't mean agreement, right? It doesn't translate into, by me trying to see where you're coming from, I'm going to agree with you. It's trying to see where someone's coming from, right?
Right.
It's building intelligence. It's starting from a place of curiosity rather than defensiveness. And when we talk about, some of the messages that are coming across in the media today and how they're overwhelming and confusing and very volatile in so many ways, I think it's coming from a place of fear and defensiveness and not curiosity, where we're not like, tell me really why this is or why you feel this way. And maybe that's what we're missing sometimes in these conversations.
That to me sounds like the basis of civil discourse, is that you come at it from a place of, I know that we've had different experiences in life and probably very different experiences,
Right.
Based on, gender and, just where we grew up and all of those things. But yet we could still, I guess there maybe needs to be an intent that we want to, and maybe that's where, what you're talking about is the intent that I even want to know your experience and that it matters.
And really see you, right?
Yeah.
See you as a human person, and that the dignity, because that's giving someone dignity, and we need to lead with that. I think you don't have to agree. You don't have to be best buddies. I think sometimes people think that too. Like, well, if diversity, I have to agree with it, and I have to be friends, and not necessarily. It just means you're recognizing the humanity of this person.
Right.
And that they have a right to a dignified life just like anyone. I mean, that's biblical, right? The Imago Dei, an image of God.
Yeah.
We're all an image of God. So.
And some would say that God sees the world through, well, now 7 point however billion people, eyes, right? Pair of eyes, and that, without that sort of knowledge, being able to see through everyone's eyes.
Yes.
But we can try with 1, 2, 1,000, 2,000. People that are around us every day, and just as we had a meeting with the new president, and he left us with this idea of respect everyone, and I like that. I think that's something I believe in. I hadn't articulated it that way, but it resonated with me.
Yeah. Right, just that basic human respect, that's so crucial.
Yeah.
And if you look at the physical world and the diversity that exists in nature that God created, and I wish we could rejoice in the diversity of humans in the way that you could look at stars or, the animal kingdom.
We go out to nature and it's like all the, the flora, the fauna,
Yes.
And
We're taking pictures.
We take so much, there's so much that we take away and we call it beautiful and wonderful. And then we get together and it's like, man, I don't like you.
We automatically, just like it,
Start putting up walls.
Absolutely, absolutely. Rather than in finding joy in that God created people differently too.
Yeah, and I find that one of the things that I like getting other perspectives, because I think that it's important. You can't begin to understand where somebody's at until you sort of understand what they've gone through. And I find more times than not that we have a lot in common. I think some of the things that stand in the way could be the language. Make it, as you say, diversity, that I understand what you mean by that, and not just sort of, there's that D word.
Right. I heard them talk about this on the news. I know what's coming. That's not right.
So.
And to ask too, if you aren't clear, just to ask. Well, where are you coming from this topic?
Yeah. Why do you believe that? Why do you feel that way?
Yeah.
I think, belief in I believe a certain way or I feel a certain way. That might be splitting hairs that they're different, but in some ways. They are. Feeling that's where the fear and all of that. But
Absolutely.
Belief is almost as more of an intellectual thing. It's
Based on the evidence, I have been led to believe in this conclusion. Right?
Yeah. The other thing that as I remember that you're also into you also social justice is one of the things. Let me first start by saying what is justice? What do you mean by what do you think is meant by justice?
Yeah, there's essentially, and I know we're getting a little short on time, but there's an old story. I don't know if that proverb, if you've heard it about.
We have as long as you have.
Oh, okay.
So.
Okay. Well, I'll make this the abridged version of justice. Basically Cornel West, and I love this quote. He says, "Justice is love in public. It's charity in public." And so we have personal points of view. We donate our time, we can donate our money, and that's great. But social justice is a broader thing. And so there's that old proverb of the town that had a river beside it, and there were bodies floating down the river, and they would pull the bodies out, and sometimes there were kids, and they would pull the kids out, and they would find homes for them, and they started building agencies to try to address the people they were pulling out of the river and meet their needs. But nobody ever asked why there were people coming down the river. And that question is justice. What is it? So we have these social problems, and we can create agencies, and we can donate, like I said, our time and our money and try to help. But justice is asking why this problem exists to begin with. We can go and feed the homeless, but why do we have homeless in a country that's one of the wealthiest in the world?
Right.
Why does this phenomenon exist? We have a child poverty rate of 1 in 5, and child hunger is really becoming a problem. It's been a problem for a while, and why does that exist? We can offer free lunch, but why is that problem there?
Yeah.
That's justice.
And that's an interesting the idea of justice, and I guess what I'm hearing is that you're saying justice is finding what's the cause, and I was talking with a lawyer several weeks ago, and asked that question, what is justice? And maybe it's because lawyers have a certain way, they know how to talk. So there wasn't a defined thing, but more of an analogy of a balancing. So for them, it was the outcome, not the question of why, but that question would lead to some sort of justice. And in his case, in the way that I understood, the way he explained it was a balancing measure so if you were harmed, or if you had committed a crime, that balancing with society, or balancing for compensation based upon the act, what had happened.
Yeah.
So even there, and this is why I think dialogue is really important, because I don't think that in how you're defining justice and how it was defined in another discipline is quite the same, or maybe they are just a different approach. I mean, that's.
No, I think that there is a little bit of dissimilarity there, But thinking about, again, coming from a sociological perspective, it's how do we organize our society, and can we do better to prevent? I'm coming maybe from a top-down perspective, where that's more of a micro perspective, more of an interpersonal between two people. As you were talking, I was thinking, a big correlate of crime is social inequality. So when you look at income, and it's not income in and of itself, but it's income inequality. So if you look at the spikes and gaps or dips of income, and you take crime rates, they almost match. So that's not the cause, and we always have to know that causation and correlation are two different things. Inequality does not cause crime. There's a relationship. So. But it goes back to the both and. We can address things at the top while also seeking justice on individual levels as well. Yeah. So it's not that I think that they can't occupy the same space. I just, But you're right, I don't think they're exactly from the same perspective, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
but to the degree that both are looking for a balancing of, I wanted to say righteousness, but that's maybe not the right, but rightness.
Rightness.
Yeah, like a balancing of why is it happening, and what can we do to balance that out so that we could minimize it. I don't know, alleviate it might be too much of a question, but one of the questions that I had was what would be a goal, like is there an end goal in terms of justice or social justice or diversity? I mean, again, I might be throwing terms out there that aren't quite.
Well,
but does that question make sense, first of all, what I'm asking?
yes, and I think one, I don't think you ever reach the magic bullet. There's no golden ticket when it comes to. I think obviously things being more equitable is the right step, or is a step in the right direction, and it doesn't always look like. Sometimes it's just doing the right thing. So, for example. I guess this would be the right thing in my opinion, but there's a lot of talk about what to do with student loan debt. You know, how do we deal with the massive student loan debt? If that was dealt with in a way that either reduced it across the board for everyone, white males, white women, black men, black females, Latinos, you know, or eliminated it for everyone, the massive wealth gap that exists between white people and black people today would diminish. So just by helping everyone, you could eliminate or just at least greatly reduce.
The clean slate sort of thing, and so
Right.
moving on our merits, or I mean, and again, I know that might even be something that is multifaceted, and
Right.
but at least there wouldn't be that. Trying to start my career and already so far
down the road.
In debt that it's going to take me 10, 15 years,
Yes.
maybe way more, depending on, what it is.
How far you go. Right.
Yeah, and go ahead.
So, I'm sorry, like policy, healthy access to health care. Yes, give everyone access to health care. Certainly lack of health care is much, much, much more devastating, obviously, to people who are poor or working class, right? But if we had easier access to health care across the board, then you've got everybody benefiting. And I think, sometimes we think that that when it comes to diversity, that it's a zero-sum game, that it's just a pie, and once that pie is given out, there's nothing else left, and that's not it. It's hard to get out of that headspace, but I think that's where a lot of people sit if I give up something or if somebody else gets something, then I'm not going to get it.
Right.
And I don't think that's an accurate way of looking at it. So I think that's a good start in terms of maybe reducing some of the injustice that we see.
Yeah, that's, and I hadn't really thought of it, but maybe I've thought of it that way is, okay, so when do we know we've achieved? When can we
Right.
say, woo, celebration time, right?
Yes.
Which I think that, but that's not a uncommon thing. I mean, we think about that all the time. We think about, what's the end goal for just in our personal lives and,
Sure.
careers and things like that. And so something like this, it would, when we think about diversity and social justice, why wouldn't we think about it that way? But what
course.
I'm hearing is that that's not maybe the way we ought to be looking at it.
Well, I mean, humans are sinful. We're always going to mess things up, right? I mean, that's what we do. I think we could do better. I think the goal is to do better. That's a good starting
Now, are we
point.
doing pretty well? I mean, let me rephrase that.
Yes.
Because we sort of, I kind of only know about the U.S., and I wouldn't say that I'm really familiar with other countries. And are there examples of countries that are doing it really well? Or, and again, I kind of want to not be comparing like, well, on a scale from 1 to 10, we're here. And but just in terms of, we're having discussions, open discussions, and they might be a little bit nasty
Sure.
sometimes, but not ours, of course. But
Oh, right, I know.
not yet, anyway.
We're not there yet. It's really, that's a really complicated question, and I think you almost could fall into a trapping of apples to oranges comparison. But I will say, before I get into maybe some of the more negative aspects, because no, I think when it comes to things like race relations, we are doing pretty horribly in this country, overall, right? Okay. But when we compare to Europe, there's still a fair amount of ethnocentrism. It's not race because they don't necessarily have the same history that we do. But when we talk about attitudes toward immigrants and Muslims, and they got their issues, right? So certainly, I think it just really depends. There are countries that are do way better economically than we do and don't have the amount of poverty and homelessness. But I was thinking this morning, actually, listening to NPR, free speech, I think we take for granted the liberty we have when it comes to expressing ourselves in this country. And hands down, it seems we lead the pack, and that's a privilege. And it does turn ugly sometimes, but it also can be this too.
Well, what about free speech? How would you define that? How would you?
Oh man, we're way out of my wheelhouse. I would say it is the ability to express yourself and your beliefs and your ideas. Now, the problem that people have is that you express yourself and your ideas, and others don't like that. And I think that there is a fair amount of responsibility that people have to take if they're on social media, or if they're in a classroom, or if they are
on a podcast.
On a podcast, right? That choose your words carefully, because you do need to be mindful of words can hurt. We were just talking, actually, my race and ethnicity class. We were talking about racial epithets and slurs. Mm. And and different approaches. Are they as impactful as people say? Are we making too much of a big deal of it? But one of the things that we need to consider is that there's a context in which this language occurs, and which words in which you say and express thoughts. There's a whole social context around that. Twitter doesn't always capture that at all.
Right. And 140 some odd characters.
Exactly. So I think, it seems a bit, personally, I feel like it's sophomoric to make a statement either way and not expect somebody to have an issue with it, or to think that it might be taken in 140 characters the way that you intended it. Because body language is a thing, inflection is a thing.
Right.
And so...
and context could take quite a few 140 characters just to give the setting of why.
Yes.
Even a thought, even if my experience, and if you start it by even saying something like, I'm not sure about this, but from my experience, and and something that yeah, that's a way more than people are. Number one, you can't do it on Twitter,
right? And
number two, it's sort of like people have to be willing to have dialogue, to like, okay, your turn to talk.
Yes.
Let me hear. Let me
and have that empathetic understanding.
Empathetic understanding. There's a good word.
So let me just try to understand where you're coming from. There's got to be that willingness.
Yeah, and I think that so language, understanding what we mean in terms. Discourse in terms of what we understand as, I call it civil discourse, but some rules of engagement, and some people love the drama. Some people love the, I didn't watch the Oscars, but sounds like a lot of drama and a lot of words can really hurt.
Yes.
And lead to bad, I don't want to say bad actions, or, repercussions. Let's put it that way.
Yes. But it's funny, that takes the news. We're on the cusp of what could possibly be a world war, right? Right. Also that day, as I read the news, if I read the news correctly, a piece of the ice shelf fell off into like a substantial piece. Scientists were a little shocked. So our sea levels are going to rise. The amount that they rise is really, they don't know yet.
Right.
So that happened kind of the same day of the Oscars. And what do? We're talking about, you know, like there's some real things that we probably should be concerned about, but rather people are debating.
It takes so you're the responsibility in free speech. Yeah, you can say what you want to, but that does it add to a level of understanding, or is it, you know?
Is it just more noise or adding to the confusion?
And I think that for a lot of people that I know, we'd really like to find a space where can have conversations without, oh, you hadn't looked into that, or you know, you don't know that,
Right.
and like I was telling you earlier, I mean, it's not that I don't want to know. It's just that life is busy and complicated, and yet we're surrounded by all these things.
Yes, and you know, I think it almost speaks to kind of a general cultural anti-intellectualism that seems to have taken hold in some spaces.
Anti-intellectualism, that's a
Yes.
mouthful.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Where we don't lead with the curiosity. We don't lead with the desire to understand. We listen just enough. I'm saying general we, just enough to shut down an argument or to own, you know, someone, or to
Getting back to the drama.
the zinger, you know,
Yeah.
get that zinger in, you know, rather than really to grow personally and intellectually.
Yeah.
So, and that to say, I mean, and I say this too when it comes to diversity, and it's social science driven. It's not just an opinion. When there are certain aspects that are data driven, okay, and we don't have to get into all that right now, but so there is a right and wrong answer, oftentimes, but that doesn't mean because somebody doesn't know, like you mentioned, that they're mean-spirited or they have malevolent intention, right? And you know, and granted, it's not everybody's job. If you come from a diverse background, if you're underrepresented, it's not necessarily that person's job to educate the world. But there are educators. There are people who have made it their job to do that. Yeah. So.
Well, one of the things I think happens too is something is thrown out as a fact. And now I'm curious enough to want to know, okay, well, you know, what?
Yeah. Where did this come from?
Where did that come from? You know, and
as you should be.
I think maybe sometimes we get into a habit or just repeating things, especially if it feels good to us. Oh,
yeah.
Okay, that supports my belief or my way of feeling, so
Yes.
I'm going to go with that without maybe having, you know, but if somebody calls me on it and says, well, why do you think that way? Or prove, you know, where's the proof in that? That's where I find that I can get a little like, oh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe that's
I really
defensiveness.
believed it. I thought it was fact, but now that you mention it, maybe I didn't really look into it. It just felt good to say, you know?
Yes. And the time in which we are, as somebody who comes from the tech background, one of my first semesters here, I was teaching a social problems course, and, you know, I think you and I are in the same age, the same generation, so, you know, I'm starting to teach in the 90s when there really wasn't the technology. You know, we didn't have a computer in our pocket.
Right.
And so, but I come here and I make the statement that neighborhoods are more segregated now than they were right after the Civil Rights Movement. And this student looked at me, he was like, really? And I was like, yeah. He picks up his phone and he Googles it. So,
Right there, huh?
Yes. And I had this moment as I'm trying to lecture, I had this moment of, oh my gosh, what if it's wrong?
It was a metaphor. I was speaking metaphorically.
Exactly. Fortunately, he looked at me and went, huh, and then put his phone down, right? And I went back and looked, and yeah, I was right. I thought I was right, but was I right? It was that kind of moment.
Well, I mean, what does that mean then? That we're more segregated because I believe that we're way more isolated. I mean, we, you know, our yards are now, you know, 10 feet by 10, you know, whatever on each side, so we're way closer together.
Yeah.
But, you know, I mean, we're isolated because we don't really know them, but
Right.
segregated, that to me, I mean, again, because my generation may just have a certain
Yeah.
connotation to it.
We've grown increasingly more racially segregated. Now, this is really more predominant in a lot of urban areas, but they can do the segregation index. And again, social science, there's a correlate that they assign to it. And so, yeah, the neighborhoods that become predominantly represented by certain different racial groups, and that's still very much a thing. So.
And that's even going back to some of the, I can't remember what they called it from a real estate, like a redlining it. Yeah.
Yep, that's
And that was something that was addressed and done away with. So the idea
Right.
that there shouldn't be discrimination when it comes to buying a house. You could buy it wherever. So how does that happen where you become more segregated?
Well, and then as a result of redlining, which I think went into around the 70s, at least unofficially, the thing with housing is that wealth, it appreciates or depreciates, right? So when you have, you have two groups of people, and one is growing wealth through their home and the location of their home, and others aren't, or they weren't ever able to buy that home. It just continues generationally, and it kind of does it itself. There doesn't have to be that policy. Gotcha. It'll now do it on its own, and then you add recessions into that, and downturns in the market.
So if you couldn't get into a home in let's just say a decent neighborhood, you ended up, maybe you could rent in that neighborhood, but now you're building somebody else's wealth. Or you ended up buying in a market that was not appreciating
Right.
a community.
Right.
So that it keeps snowballing downward, I guess, from that standpoint, while the others.
It gets, it accumulates.
Yeah.
Right, absolutely.
I want to go to technology. You'd mentioned that and how that's changed. How do you think technology is impacting your field and society, maybe in general, from a sociologist's point of view?
Well, again, I'm not as versed in the literature from the technological side, but I think, from a sociological perspective, I will say I don't think it's a negative thing in general, right? I don't think that technology, we should be worried, or we should try to dial it back. And so I teach a course in social change, and the thing that I tell my students is that the one constant is that society is constantly changing. I mean, we're constant, and this is just another way that we're changing. So our patterns of interaction are changing. Like FaceTime and And I know we've talked negatively about technology, but there is a way. I mean, that access to information is great. I use it. We all use it. It's just so much more accessible. It makes it more equitable. Knowledge is becoming more equitable as long as people have access to the internet. Where people, I think, are falling short, where there's a growing gap, is to be able to think critically about that knowledge that we have in our hand, that we're reading and being exposed to. We could probably improve.
What do you mean by think critically about it?
As you mentioned, when you read something and somebody was like, well, where did you get that? How do you know that? Are you going to explore that a little farther? I think when people get that factoid that comes on, especially if it feels good, especially if we like it, are we going to look deeper, into the source?
Yeah.
If something doesn't quite sound right, are we going to explore that a little more? So I think that's maybe a crucial piece that we're missing. And again, as long as it's accessible. And that's interesting too, because it's, if you think about certain, producers of music or art or literature, they're able to get their stuff out there where they may not have had the resources, and so all that is great.
Yeah.
All that is great. There's also some really terrible ideas. I mean, we have a whole. Frankly, the QAnon movement that comes from this 8chan, 4chan disgruntled people on the internet, and now there's a whole, and and it's not just crazies talking to crazies, that there's actually some stuff that happens that's not good for our country as a result. So certainly there's that negative piece.
And there's also the effect that it has on all of us, but the Generation Z, and I guess now there's one coming up called Alpha.
Oh, I haven't heard that one.
Yeah, well, when I was looking into Generation Z, it kept coming up, and I was like, what?
Yes.
So, but Generation Z in particular, I mean, born with the device nearby.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, here, stop crying. Look at
Yes.
the iPad for a minute. And,
Yes.
and now technology is there. It's as much a part of them as anything
Yes.
else. But
Yes.
there's some things coming out of that I mean, we have a higher rate of suicides and anxiety, depression among that age group. From a tech, and a sociologist, y'all must. I mean, are you throwing your hands up on that one? Like,
Well, and again, I told my student, I'm teaching a course in gender, and this is probably, honestly, one of the best courses I have had in years. I love the students in this course, and we are tackling some things that, it's been years, and it's been years since I've had students with kind of the intellectual chops to do this with, and so it's been a lot of fun. And I told them recently, I was like, it seems like sometimes nobody reinvents the wheel. That it's just different packaging. So, for example, we got into this discussion on women and body types and physical looks and the pressure to be beautiful. And I showed him this clip, or this short documentary that was pretty dated, right? So it's Jean Kilbourne. And so she's going through it at the time that she's talking. She's looking at magazines, Cosmopolitan and Mademoiselle, and all these old magazines that I remember reading when I was growing up, and about how, and she really gives a critical assessment of how skinny the women are, how they're positioned in very passive, poses, the unrealistic body types, the unrealistic face, that kind of thing. And so some of my students were saying, well, yeah, this is interesting and I can understand, but she's talking about magazines. So we got into this discussion of, well, is this even relevant anymore?
Yeah.
Well, then we started talking about TikTok and Instagram, and it's the same thing, right? It's just, and what's worse is you have, and you can help me out, what is the algorithms? That you start to, so, they just keep popping up.
It's all about categorizing and sorting.
Right.
Yeah, and then when you add an intelligence on top of that, so I categorize, I sort it, serve it to you, and find out what you really, what you like, and now I can keep doing that, but start feeding you more of this stuff, and it's almost like you get to a point where you're just consuming, and not really critically even assessing what.
Right.
And so this is one of the things I've found in my research is that, and I just did an article on advertising and artificial intelligence, is that it reinforces a stereotype almost, or reinforces maybe not a view of yourself and what you get, but the things that you want to see,
Right.
the things that you want to hear, and it's built to be really good at that. Precision, getting it so effective and efficient at what it does, and that's one of the things that we need to be wary of is that you might be getting. I might see things that it thinks I want to see based on my gender, race, age, all of these things, and if I only get to see that and I interact with that and never anything outside of that, I just get more and more of the same, essentially, and it reinforces, okay, well, this is who I am, and that was really one of the, I guess, whoa, that's crazy that could
Or
go
this
on.
is what a woman is supposed to look like, right? I
Yeah,
mean, maybe you do a quick search on some fitness tips. So I'm going to go to the gym. How do I work out? And then suddenly I'm getting, and then I go down, and now I'm getting, and as I understand it, there's tips on how to be bulimic, how to be, how to starve yourself, and that's where we get into some really troublesome issues.
Yeah. And that's not even considering how sociology is going to be impacted when we have robots.
Oh, yes.
That we'll say that for another.
Oh, goodness, yes, and sentience and who
Yeah,
has
that's
what.
That's got to
Yes.
be a whole nother level of sociology, because technology is already a part of our lives in ways that we really don't understand yet. I mean, it's happening so fast. We're told for us
yes.
to even get our head around it.
And changing so quickly, like you said. Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you for your time and
course,
for
this is
helping
fun.
me understand quite a bit, actually.
I feel like I've
And-
understood some things too, actually.
Good. And do this again sometime.
I hope so.
Yeah. I want to thank you for joining us on this episode of Help Me Understand with Dr. Thomas Jeffrey. And if you'd like to subscribe to the podcast, then you can do that and be updated whenever a new episode comes online. Thank you, and have a wonderful day. Thank you
That
so
was
much.
fun.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, thank you very
Well, I
much.
mean, we-
Didn't even-